Good morning. What a beautiful morning. We just got back from Burnt Cabin Church Camp yesterday, and it was a great week of camp. Being with the high school boys has been a blessing that I've been able to have for the last, I think, 18 years, and it was a wonderful, wonderful year. As a matter of fact, I said this might have been probably the best year since I'd probably go back 12 years. It was just a really great week. The high school boys cabin specifically, I was blessed to be with Travis Dewey and Scott Keel and Reese Parker, and it is just incredible to have the three guys that have had an influence on my life to be able to serve with. I mean, Travis, going through the things that he's had to go through and to be where he is and to have the kids looking up to him for both athletic and spiritual reasons, to have a mentor like Reese Parker, who was one of my camp counselors, to be there and to watch kids of this age want to still gain knowledge and experience from Reese, because he's one of the neatest guys I've ever known. And then, of course, Scott, who has been a mentor, because even in the middle of the night, many times over the last 20, 25 years, he'd get a note from me saying, "Hey, you need to walk me off the ledge on this one, because I just read this and you got to help me with it." So to watch kids from the ages of 13, 14 up to 18 interact with men like these three guys, it's just an amazing deal. So it's also fun because camp is a very tiring thing. To watch us older guys deal with these younger guys is fun. I don't believe that any of us got to bed before 1:30 any night last week, which was better than in some years, but it was fun. And yesterday, I had the extra pleasure of getting home. I did get my hour-and-a-half nap and was getting ready to go back over my initial notes for today's class when we received a phone call, an urgent phone call. Actually, I saw a text on my iPad that says, "Call me," from Malia. And she had left a few hours earlier to go to Chickasha for a wedding. And when I got to the phone, she said, "I've been in a car accident. We're okay, but they're in Chickasha, Oklahoma." So at 6 o'clock last night, we headed to Chickasha to get the stuff out of her car, pick them up from the wedding that they were heading to, and bring them home. So I got my 7th straight 1:30 morning. And one of the most fun questions of the night was, "Jerry, are you ready for your class tomorrow?" And I said, "We'll see." So fortunately, you guys had a great lead-in by Gerald last week. The introduction to Ezekiel, he did a fantastic job. That Bible Project video, the Bible Project is a really cool video series. Obviously, anytime you're listening to somebody else give the summaries of things, you need to just be cognizant of going back and actually reading to make sure what they said was accurate. But the Bible Project has a number of really cool videos over the books and gives really good highlights of things. And this specifically one on Ezekiel is fantastic. I also have another source that I like to go to when it comes to preparing for a lesson or preparing for reading for a book. Wes McAdams, the minister at McDermott Road, put out a book called Beyond the Verse a number of years ago. And he talks about how powerful it is when you read an entire book together, the way it was intended to be read, the way it was written. And what he does with his basically a little summary book is, when you're looking in this book, these are the things that you might want to look for. This is what I saw, and this is how cool it is when it's all put together in one piece. And Ezekiel is one of the books that when you go to his little version of what to look for in Ezekiel, he starts off like this. He says, "This is not a book for the children to be reading." And of course, I handed this book to a bunch of high schoolers this past week that were in my group, about 9 of them. And what's the first thing that they find? they find these very same words about Ezekiel. This is not for children to read. This is like it's not PG. This is closer to R. So what do they read? We keep hearing them go, hey, look at this chapter or look at that chapter. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble or if it's good that I've got them reading the Bible. But this is an incredible book. It's going to have imagery. It's going to have things that it's going to show exactly what God wanted us to see about Israel, about the state of Israel, about the things that were to come against his people. And yes, those horrible things that get said in some of these chapters are directed directly at his people. So if you recall, as Gerald finished chapter 1 last week, we're going to see that the living creature's wings, it's going to make a great crashing of water sound, and it's a roar, and it's going to stop in verse 24. But it's not going to stay silent for long, because in verse 28 of chapter 1, he's going to hear the voice of Yahweh, God himself speaking from the throne. And Ezekiel's going to be addressed. Now, not by name, but we know he's being addressed, and he's in a posture of he's being humble. He's being totally showing humility. He's in a prostrate on his face when he's being addressed. And he's going to be addressed in verse 1 of chapter 2 as the Son of Man. Now, in many of the books, when we see Son of Man, there's some extra meaning applied to it. In the book of Daniel, even when Jesus uses it. In this case, there's really not any significance, so don't overread that. But basically, when we're reading Son of Man in Ezekiel, the term is going to be referencing just being man, simply human. He's speaking to him sort of like, hey, mister. It's not really putting any kind of spiritual emphasis on it. It's just saying you're just a man. And we're going to see God commission Ezekiel in these next 11 chapters. We're going to see the call of the prophet, and we're going to see the accusation against Israel. So because of the way we're structuring this summer, last week, today, and next week, we're going to cover like half the book, and then we're going to slow it down just a little bit, and then we're going to end the last 3 classes on the book of Daniel. So we are going to move rather fast. Hope you read ahead. I believe you should be reading chapters 12 through 24 next week. Whether we accomplish that or not, I don't know. And I will tell you, chapter 12 through 24 is where all that stuff is that is probably not great for the little one's eyes. So just be aware. So we're going to see that he's not to stay prostrate in that position, because he's going to be told to stand up. Now, I think this must be where Justin comes up with the get on your feet every time he gets up here, because prostrate is going to be a position where you're going to show humility. It's going to be a position that is basically not ready to do any service. You're just showing your reverence. But standing up is going to say you're in a position and ready to hear. You're ready to obey the word that you're about to hear. And he knows he's in the presence of King on his throne. So that prostrate was the appropriate posture for the submission, but now it's time for action, so he's to stand. And what we're going to see in the first 2 or 3 chapters is 4 basic sequences. The first is going to be this commissioning. As I said, the call of the prophet, the call for Ezekiel to be God's spokesman against a rebellious people of Israel. And it's going to be followed by a physical and some symbolic action with some very graphic things identifying Ezekiel with that message. In fact, he's going to eat the scroll in which the message is written. The third sequence is this commission is going to repeat, and there's going to be some additional information, some additional encouragement, and that's in chapter 3. And then finally, in this first part of the first 3 chapters, we're going to see that the whole vision is going to recede, and Ezekiel's going to be transported back to where he was encamped in the first weeks, and he's going to be recuperating. He's exhausted. He's probably like a senior high school boy cabin and girl cabin counselor. He's exhausted at this point, and he's going to have to recuperate. So this chronological sequence of events is going to take us through this first part, and then the second part is going to be talking more about the accusation. So in chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, and 4 through 7, we're going to hear some descriptions about Israel. There's an introduction, and Ezekiel's going to have an interesting style, and you see it in preachers, you see it in teachers, and that style is this: never say anything once. If you can say it several times, preferably multiple synonyms and repeated phraseology, that's what Ezekiel's going to do over and over and over again. When I very first came back from law school, I didn't enjoy Bill Keel's sermons, and I've told Bill, so if he ever watches this, he will remember our conversation, I'm sure. But the reason was I said, Bill, it seems like you just repeat everything. I got it the first time. And he said, well, I'm talking to different levels of education and spiritual maturities in here, so I've got to make sure I get everybody. So yeah, I'm teaching to different levels. And I just wondered later, I wonder which level I was. I hope it wasn't that first level. But you see this in Ezekiel. You see a lot of this. Even in the first few verses of chapter 2, you're going to see 7 occurrences of rebel or rebellious. So this is the point of view from God. This is how God's going to characterize his people. Even in the exile, the hardened obduracy or the stubbornly persistent wrongdoing of Israel is going to continue. And what we're going to see is there's going to be three features out of the accusations against Israel that we're going to that will be clear in this second chapter. First, Ezekiel's going to be sent to eradicate or accuse them of their disloyalty. The story of Israel, we hear the story of Israel, and it's a history of covenant. It's a salvation history. But from God's perspective, if you've never really thought about this, which is where Ezekiel is going to be coming from, it's a story of constant disloyalty to God. It's a constant disobeying. They are going to be rebellious. And the words that are going to be used here are, when it says in verse 3, rebelled against me, in revolt against me, these are political words. So this is suggesting a political context. So the idea of Israel as a nation, a vassal nation to the suzerain Yahweh, is going to be drawn on those international treaties that we kind of talked about 2 weeks ago to conclude Nehemiah. So Yahweh was the great king. He's the suzerain. He's committed to the salvation and the protection of his subjects. Israel's the vassal state. But the vassal state has become rebellious against its king. It's Yahweh. It's God. And Ezekiel's going to expand this point with some very grotesque historical allegories. And this experience of the exile is going to, it should have induced a change of heart in the people in this history, but it didn't. Sadly, it didn't. The revolt of their fathers, like we talked about last week when they started, or 2 weeks ago when we discussed how the covenant began, how that treaty, that formula for a treaty occurs, the revolt of their fathers continued to that very day, the day of Ezekiel's vision. So the divine perspective of Israel combines their past history and their present state in making this threat, which is going to be an inevitable final judgment. The second thing, part of the accusation, is defiance. In verses 4 through 5, you're going to see mention the fathers recall the fact that Israel was not just a nation in a political sense. They were also Israel wasn't just the United States, it was a community. It was a religion. It was all these things put together. It wasn't just one facet like a political entity, or it wasn't just a national entity. It wasn't just a religious entity. It was more like a family, a kinship identity. The family imagery is going to come to the forefront, and it's going to come to the forefront in a different way, though. It's going to use the language as a house. The title, House of Israel, should be an honored title, but it's going to be debased because he's going to call it a house of defiance. He's going to illustrate the family by saying they're a rebellious people. They're deceitful children unwilling to listen to the Lord's instructions. He's going to describe Israel as an ungovernable family. And I know we've all seen ungovernable families, maybe in our own families. And he's going to draw this picture of this stubborn, rebellious, incorrigible son, like what we see in Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21. These are people who not only do not show any feelings towards God, but also are determined. They're resolute in their determination to not show any feelings. Their faces are frozen as their hearts are. So we're going to move into another category of this accusation against Israel, and it's going to be a deafness. In verses 4 through 7 in chapter 3, not only are the heart and the faces frozen, so are their ears. It's not that they just do not respond to Yahweh. It's not that they don't respond. It's that they're not even prepared to listen. So it's not that they are just going to hear it and let it through. It's just they're not even prepared for this. And he's going to highlight this incredible, willful deafness of Israel. And he's going to use a technique that he's going to use later in the chapters. It's going to be a rhetorical comparison of Israel with other nations, much to the disadvantage of Israel themselves. This is one of those things that when I go to Cambodia and I come back, I always have the same thought. I think it's easier to teach in Cambodia than it is to teach in the United States, because we have different ideas, and what we're competing against here is something different than when you go over there and they've not even heard the message. Yes, there's a language barrier, but they've not even heard the language or the message. So there's a willingness at least to try to hear the message. Here in the United States, there's a message, we've heard the message, and there's just flat out disregard. We're not even wanting to hear somebody. If you go down to the courthouse and the man's preaching from the Bible, a lot of times, me included, ignore him. Because he's kind of wacko, right? No, he's not wacko. He's teaching from the Word. But that's the perception that some people have. That's the perception that we have when we hear a message from somebody that's not necessarily from our fellowship. So he's going to talk about this in a way that shows that it's far easier for someone to overcome a mental and spiritual block than it is for the hardness of the heart. The prophet, he's going to say that to share the same language, concepts, traditions, and history was one thing, but that's not going to overcome this barrier of somebody that's not prepared to hear it, not somebody that wants to listen. The body language that he's going to use is this stiff face, hard heart, unwilling ears, and it's going to be rounded off with this forehead, this reference to the forehead, the hardening, the obstinance. They are strong of forehead and hard of heart. The forehead's the place where the law of Yahweh is supposed to be tied as a symbol of obedience. It's supposed to be right there on display. Instead, he's saying Israel's collective forehead had become as hard as bronze and unblushingly brazen. So, as often as we see in the Bible, the stubbornness of God's own people is far worse than the ignorance of the foreigners and pagans. I think that was an interesting point. It would be far easier for Ezekiel to cross-culturally be a missionary, like going to Cambodia, than to prophet to his own people. And we see other references of that in the New Testament. So the mission of God's prophet, this is who he was being called to be. He was what he was being called to be. This was the challenge that he was going to face. And he's going to be challenged with this hardness that comes from, he's going to have to face this hardness with the Word of God. And he's going to be unwelcome. And he gets that. And this cannot be something that he was like, yes, I get to go to some exotic place or whatever. I'm going to have to take a message to people that I know are not even prepared to receive it. And think about some of the prophets or the leaders of old, Moses and Jeremiah before him. Think about what kind of, they protested it. They protested. We don't actually see any protests coming from Ezekiel from this call, but we do. You can read between the lines that he's got some issues with it, but he doesn't come out and say it. He's not going to protest it out loud and protest this prophetic call. But he is being sent by God's Spirit. The role of the Spirit of Yahweh in the ministry of Ezekiel is very distinct. In this book. The Spirit who comes to him is going to lift him to his feet. It's going to enable him to hear. It's going to provide the things to come from his voice from the one that's going to be Yahweh on the throne. So the first words that he hears is empowered by the Spirit is that God is sending him. The word Selah, characteristic of a call and ministry of all the prophets. It's going to be emphasized and repeated throughout 4 or 5 different chapters today. The one thing is he recognizes this is going to be an unpopular message, and the audience he gets is going to be resistant. And there's going to be a day when just taking the message, there's got to be some kind of reward, and it's kind of like what we would call a recognition formula. You're not going to be successful with the message to these people because they're not even going to hear it. They're not even going to be willing it. But this recognition formula is they will know, which normally refers to the acknowledgement of Yahweh himself, that he is the prophet. And it's going to be exactly what Ezekiel's going to benefit from this, because Ezekiel's going to share in this reputation that he belongs to God and he's on behalf of God being sent. So he's being told he's going to have to speak the words to this unlistening, this unrepentant, this disloyal, this nation. And he's going to say, you must speak my words to them. And this concept it's fundamental for the prophet. This is the whole point. The prophet is supposed to be God's mouth. And, he's going to have this promise that, like his predecessors, there's going to be no freedom to decide what that message is that he's going to have to give. He doesn't get to make it up, unlike what most folks in the academic world and in the agnostic and atheist world. This is not something that Ezekiel just made up because this was his preference, this was his bias, this was his lens that he wanted to present. This is God's message. It is written for him already. And we get to see this in some very interesting imagery. The words are going to be delivered to him from Yahweh. And specifically, my words in your mouth. Now this is obviously a prophetic claim that when the prophet speaks, it's coming from God. But in this case, he's going to be ordered to eat the scroll filled with the words of lament and mourning and woe. So in this vision, he's being told he's going to eat the scroll of the words. And part of the imagery that I hope you get is the hand that's holding the scroll is God's. So it's directly from God, and it is going to be the words that would come from him. And I think the sensory experience of this should show that this is something that is going to grow within inside him. This is going to nourish him. This is going to be exactly what God wants, and it's going to exhume Ezekiel, and that's the fruit that he's going to present. This is possibly suggested. It's been a metaphor from Jeremiah 15:16 when it says, "When your words came, I ate them. They were my joy and my heart's delight." But for Ezekiel, it's going to be a real sensory experience because in this vision, there's going to be this idea that he's eating the words of God so that that's what he will present. And understand that it is the full experience, because first he's going to absorb the word of God and not just taste it, not just gnaw on it. It's going to fill his stomach. He's going to fully digest it. It's going to become a part of him. Just like I said, it's nourishing, it's energizing, it's empowering. And then we're going to see this paradox that the word was to eat and then to speak, and no longer, it was going to be long and it was going to be bitter. The act of obedience itself, though, was as sweet as honey. The scroll itself is not a mystery. It was God's word. It comes hand stretched out, unmistakably connecting God and Ezekiel. The word comes from God himself, and the scroll has fully been written. Left no opinion, no subjectivism, no humanism, none of these isms that our world today is enamored with. This was God's will. This was God's wish. This was God's call. And it's going to be quite a message. Ezekiel's account of his call differs from that of Moses, and it differs from Isaiah and Jeremiah in that we don't hear a word of response from his own mouth. We do see some reaction, though. First, the most strong, God addresses his fear. So we know he had fear. He's going to be feared because he's going to be addressing his own traumatized community that's been in exile. They've been divided, they've been exiled, they've been dragged from their homes. The idea of being dragged from Jerusalem is so deep and so important. And if you've never really grasped this, the ancients believed that God was transcendent, all-powerful. They would absolutely think that we are nonsensical crazy for thinking that we have a God, a warm, fuzzy, love God that we can approach just in prayer and think that we have a relationship with. They would think that's crazy. And because of that, they had a tabernacle that God told them to create, because that was the bridge to gap the chasm between the finite and the infinite. The only way that they could live amongst God was to have this place for God to sit, to be with them, to have the chasm be bridged. They've lost that. They've lost the place in which all of this was taking place, the holy city. They've lost that. They're out. God, in a sense, is exiled with them. And they're traumatized. And he's not going to be giving the same message that other prophets are giving them. What do you think most prophets would be, or so-called prophets are telling the exiles at this point? They're talking about when we go back, it's going to be okay. This message of hope, it's not going to be long. Ezekiel's message is going to be completely the opposite and terrifying. This is not going to be something that is going to be good. Jeremiah had been imprisoned in Jerusalem for such talk. This is not a message that he's looking forward to giving, and he's afraid. And God's going to talk about his courage and how he's going to need to overcome this. And we're going to see God's going to stifle a little bit of momentary protest. In verse 8 of chapter 2, he's going to start with this phrase, but you, son of man, which it's a new sentence, it's a new thought. And he's going to say, it goes on, do not rebel like that of the rebellious house. So he knows Ezekiel's heart. He's warning him, don't be like them. You're afraid, you may want to protest, but don't rebel. Take this message, take this commission that's being given. And what's going to be clear is that he's being set apart. We're all called to be set apart. God is personally inviting him, telling him to be set apart from the house of defiance. Ezekiel can no longer be part of such a house. And he must not defy Yahweh like they do. So third, God's going to address his feeling of weakness. So fear, little protest, and weakness. In chapter 3, verses 4 through 11, he's going to repeat the commission. And he's going to support this hint of this protest, and he's going to get to the main point. The problem of Ezekiel's personal weakness and sensitivity in the face of an audience that has already been repeatedly described as hardened in every relevant part of their anatomy. So he's going to, if the words of Ezekiel had to speak were in fact the well-digested words of God, then refusing it would be refusing to listen to God himself. So what fear, what weakness it would take to turn away from this vision, from this message. And we're going to see God call him to an act of an imagery, an act of discipleship that is going beyond what we consider Christians and shepherds and all these different imageries that we use. He's going to develop it into the watchman imagery. And we're going to see that. He's going to promise Ezekiel that there's going to be hatred from the people. There's going to be resisting. It's going to be terrible on the psyche of himself and the people. What he's going to be rendering is going to be, it's going to be to the hardened of all stones, harder than flint, the unyielding. And it's going to be, he's going to need to be hardened himself in order to be able to go through some of these psyche things. He's going to go through the hardening himself so that he can endure what's going to lie ahead. So Ezekiel is going to be transported in this vision, transported by God's Spirit back to where he started and the back home in the home of Tel Aviv, where the navigation center was. And we're going to see from here some very interesting things. We're going to see him take on an act. It's kind of like in theater. Prophets had different tools that they used to get their message across, sort of like the gentleman I mentioned earlier, preaching from the Bible at the courtroom steps. Different kinds of things. They would also have some theater, and this is what we're about to see. We're going to see Ezekiel back home utilizing some theater to show this message of doom for the people of God. And in this week, since there was a birthday encounter with Yahweh, it's going to, in verse 22, verse 33, Yahweh is going to speak, and it's time to impress upon the people the life and death urgency of the task ahead. So the responsibility of the watchman, as I mentioned earlier, is going to continue into this theater. And the idea is, Jeremiah 6:17 through 21 is the background for this watchman idea. Not only does it use this imagery of prophets as a divinely appointed watchman, but think about who's warning who and what he's warning them of. The prophet is warning them of God, but he's been given the warning from God. So think of the watchman as the sentry. You know, they in the Israelite village or city in times of invasion, the watchmen would be the ones up high, posted on a tower or an elevated place during the military campaign. And when they spotted danger, their goal was to blow a trumpet or a horn, call out loudly, awaken the rest of the inhabitants so the army or whoever was available could at least try to stop the attack. And if the attack came and the people got killed, somebody was going to be blamed. And the blame would go to the sentry, the watchman, if he didn't make the call. If he did make the call, then he had fulfilled his responsibility. And this is going to be important for Ezekiel as well, because again, if he's the watchman and he's making the call and they don't listen, that's not on him. And that's a hard lesson for us all today. Some of us have family members, kids, children, people that we love that rebel against God. They're not rebelling against us. They're rebelling against God. It's not necessarily us that are failing them. It's they've turned their face from God. And this is a message to Ezekiel. You're gonna get their face is going to turn from God, and you are going to do your job and do your job as well as you can, and it's still not going to be enough. And that's his watchman commission. That's what he's being told to do. And he's going to give this warning, and he's going to give it in this drama format. He's going to lay on his side, facing one direction as a symbol for Judah, facing the other direction for symbolizing the punishment of Israel. Judah will be reduced to eating food not only in ration supply, but also in defilement. So you can read what the food's being cooked up on top of. This is all important for them to recognize that they have, this is what exile is. This is what their sin and their father's sin and their continued refusal, their defiance has called. And he's going to lay on his right side several times a day. He's going to lay on his left side, and he's going to shave his head and beard and divide the cut hair into 3 parts. And each of these 3 parts are part of the judgment. A remnant of that cut hair is spared, but even a portion of that remnant will be destroyed. So he's letting them see visually what is happening, what is coming. The coming judgment on the land of Judah. He's going to continue the message and prophesy against Israel's mountains, the scenes of where the idolatry occurred. And a remnant will survive the judgment, and they will have this divine judgment in what in chapter 7 verse 2 would be judgment of finality. It's an outpouring of wrath from God. It's unsparing, and it's going to affect all sectors of life. Money and idols will be useless. There's nothing that we will have or be able to do, they will be able to do to escape this. And it's sort of like in Micah 6 when Micah's asking God, what is it that I can do to have a relationship with you? Is there anything? Is it the young bulls, 1 year old? Is it a sacrifice of 1,000 rams? Is it rivers of oil? And the truth is, no. There's nothing on our planet. There's nothing that we can produce. There's nothing that we can provide that will allow us to have that relationship with God. And in this case, there's nothing that we can do that will stop God's wrath. Not our money, not the idols. Everything will be useless. So this judgment is coming. It will come. And we see in 2 or 3 places it's because God wants them to know that I am the Lord. So we're going to see in chapters 8 through 11 some visions of abominations. We're going to see God depart, and we're going to see a future hope. And he's going to have this another, in verse 8, it's going to be a vision, but it's going to be a vision that it could have occurred. It's something physical. It's something that he actually could have envisioned himself in presence of the things in the temple. Now, of course, he wouldn't be able to go into certain parts of the temple, so he's being transported by the Spirit to Jerusalem to witness not only the image of jealousy and engravings of idolatrous images on the walls of the temple, but also how the elders and the women and the men of Judah are going to be engaging in adulterous worship. God's going to send out executioners. So this is a fascinating part of Ezekiel that I encourage you guys to read through 8 through 11 again before you start your study for next week. But in verse 1 in chapter 8 to start, we're going to see that Ezekiel's going to, again, Ezekiel's so good about dates and times. He's going to date this again. It's September 17th, 592 BC, about 14 months after the initial call. And he's going to get to take another visionary flight over the desert and be put into Jerusalem at the gateway of the northern edge of the temple court. And he's going to tour progressively closer to the more sacred areas. He's going to start at the outside and then work towards the inner in 4 stages. And each of these are going to be themed together with a further departure from Yahweh, from the temple, from the city that bore his name. So we're going to see Yahweh leave. And these 4 scenes, we're going to start with the statute of jealousy, provoking jealousy. Jealousy is, it means the anger, God's anger by being rejected and betrayed. And it's a proper response. If you're betrayed, to have this jealousy, and especially when you've got this covenant of love, this covenant of obligation, of loyalty, and it's completely ignored. Not only ignored, they have refused, and they've continued to refuse, and it's going to provoke God's jealousy. So the vision is going to become surreal, it's going to become dreamlike, and Ezekiel is going to see a hole in the wall, and it's going to require to dig, and he finally finds a door, and in that door there's going to be some strange things. He's going to gain access to an inner room. It's going to be dark, but there's going to be some things visible. There's going to be crawling things, images of all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals, and all the idols of the house of Israel. This first expression of creeping or crawling creatures it's derogatory. This is bad. There is intent here, and we should be able to recognize that. It's going to be repulsive, and the animals are going to be portrayed as disgusting, revolting, just as the idols are. Droppings of their excrement. There's this strong recollection of these things that were being prohibited back in Deuteronomy. And this is what has now found its way into the temple. It's going to continue with these cults, eyes blinking with return to the daylight. Ezekiel is confronted with something in his divine walk through the temple. Closer now to the most sacred part, he's going to focus on the main forecourt in the front of the temple itself, and he's going to see and hear groups of women mourning the Tammuz. The cult of the mourning Tammuz seems to have Babylonian had customs. Women probably had strong links to the Greek cult of Adonis, who was similarly lamented among women, like what is being described here. And Tammuz gave his name to the Mesopotamian month of June and July when this cult was practicing, since that was the heat of the summer when vegetation died, and is often thought that he was dying and rising, a nature god similar to others found throughout the other ancient Near East cultures, some type of fertility cult. So we're seeing these women in the forecourt worshiping the cult of Tammuz, and this is offensive. And we're going to see the elders. We're going to see other pagan situations, the sun worship. The last scene of Ezekiel's temple court is going to take place to the closest to the inner shrine, and it's going to be in the inner court at the entrance of the temple between the portico and the altar, and it's going to be 25 men engaged precisely in the opposite of what the priests would have been doing. Instead of turning to the Lord, they were turning out to the sun and literally turning their backs toward the temple of God. The description is both physical and metaphorical. The temple is behind them. They've turned their backs on the covenant of God right in front of his face. These men were literally lifting their backsides to God. There's that last bit of imagery there in verse 17, chapter 8, verse 17, putting the branch to their nose. And this might be some kind of obscene gesture that symbolized an insult, but one thing's for sure, it wasn't a good thing. It's obvious that this was to be read as something very, very bad. And it was time, as you can read there, that it's time for no mercy. The time for appeals are over. Judgment must fall, and it's time to call in the executioners. And in chapter 9, the executioners are going to enter, and this is apocalyptic like Daniel or of John in Revelation. These are heavenly angelic beings that are going to be seen to carry out the divine will on earth in relation to the events. This part of human history was beyond repair, and this would be carried out by the Babylonians. It would not be the angels, but it would be God's way of getting his wish done, and it was going to be a judgment and execution. And the reality, the swords in the hands of the Babylonians, the enemies, would be the one that would serve this divine justice. And all of these characteristics, all these things in the vision, are happening when we are seeing some things happen with God's Spirit as well. So as we continue down, we'd see different stages of God's rising, God's moving further and further away, and he's going to leave. And from the prophet's point of view, is there anything worse than the idea that God has left them? He's going to have to defend. He's going to have to defend the Israelites, and they're not going to listen. We're going to see that God is going to be suspended in chapters 10 through 11, and basically in the last part of this section we were to cover today, the prophet is, it's taken place in Jerusalem. He's seen the image of jealousy. He's seen the engravings and idolatrous images on the walls. He's seen how the elders and the women, the men of Judah, are engaging in these idolatrous worships. God sends out the executioners to execute the judgment on everyone that does not mourn over Israel's idolatry. And the glory that Ezekiel has seen at his call departs from the temple and the city. God tells Ezekiel that Jerusalem's leaders should not presume to think they will escape the coming judgment, because they won't. God's going to scatter his people in judgment, and he gives a message of hope to end this section in verses 17 through 20 in chapter 11. But he will restore them to the land, giving a remnant of a heart of flesh to God's commands. I know we did a lot, and I know I didn't cover a lot, so please take a look at those chapters. Next week, Mr. Burrow will hit chapters 12 towards 24. It's an incredible book. It's an incredible book, and I hope you enjoy your study. Let's end with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so very much for this day. Thank you for your word that you've given us so that we can understand who you are, and what your mind is, so that we can reflect upon that in our walk with your Son. Father, thank you so very much for the opportunity to come together as a family that loves one another and is willing to wrap our arms around each other in your name. Father, thank you so very much for this morning, and please bless our worship. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.